Thanks everybody for joining in our July dealer webinar. I am excited to talk about some new technology that we're utilizing in the DAC racing formula. So let's go ahead and get started. So the racing formula as it is now is a vitamin and mineral supplement for adult horses. It's got some key features already: organic selenium, it's got natural vitamin E. It's got chelated minerals, bioavailable minerals from Alltech. And it's a really great product as it stands. What are these ingredients used for? Well, trace minerals are really important for iron, for example, plays a critical role in oxygen transport so that we can get more oxygen around the body for that moderate to lower intensity exercise. It's got some probiotics in there. It's got biotin. Biotin is a water-soluble B vitamin, and typically I don't add a lot of B vitamins to horses' diets because if they're eating plenty of forage and they've got a healthy hindgut, those bacteria make all the B vitamins they need. However, in a horse like a horse that's getting racing formula, that's doing a lot of intense exercise, chances are their hindgut is a little out of whack to start with, just due to all of the exercise and traveling, etc., that we're doing with them. So adding a little B vitamins can be beneficial because we know those hindgut probably aren't working that great. Now, it's not really a source of protein, and it's not in the past been a source of energy. And it's still not a source of energy, but we've incorporated a new technology that's going to enable the horse to unlock more energy from the diet that you feed it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, performance horses. When people ask me, well, when do you feed the racing formula versus when do you feed the DAC Orange or the Total Performance? The Total Performance and the racing formula have always been for horses that are at very high levels of exercise. That if you look at the nutrient requirements for horses, when you get to the upper levels of moderate and intense exercise, their vitamin and mineral requirements change. So this product and the Total Performance have always been for horses doing higher, harder exercise. That might be higher level exercise in the competition ring, or it might be just harder work at home, whether it be work horses that are plowing fields or buggy horses, for example. The nutritional support for horses at this high level of exercise needs to benefit the immune system, benefit muscle contraction, because what is exercise or work? It's the ability to contract one's muscles. That's how you make movement, and movement is work. And also the ability for those muscles to recover. And the difference between a good performance horse or a high level performance horse and one that just never makes it typically lies in their ability to contract muscles and their ability to recover. Now, I want to switch gears and focus primarily on horses that do exercise at speed. Your barrel racing horses, race horses, standardbred race horses, cross country, 3-day eventing or eventing, anything that needs to be done at speed. We need power and we need short bursts of energy. In order to fuel that type of performance, we need carbohydrates, primarily glucose, for those fast twitch muscle fibers. Now, before we get too much further, I want to I've put together a little glossary, because you're going to hear these words and you're going to think, well, I think I know what she's talking about, but I wish I knew. So we're going to go back to basics. We've always had success when we do that, just to get everybody on exactly the same page with the words we are using. I'll use the term glucose. Glucose is a simple sugar which is an important energy source in all living organisms and is a component of many carbohydrates. When you eat food, it gets broken down into fats and proteins, fibers, which are different types of carbohydrates, and glucose, which is a simple sugar. Glycogen, we've heard this term glycogen. Now, are glycogen and glucose the same thing? No. Glycogen is a substance deposited in bodily tissues as a store of carbohydrates. It's a polysaccharide which forms glucose when you put water with it. So we eat food, it gets broken down in the gut, and you absorb glucose into the bloodstream. Now that glucose, if it's not being used immediately, has to get stored. And it's going to get stored. We're going to take away some of that moisture that we don't need. We're going to cut off some of the water molecules, and we're going to store it as glycogen in the muscle. Okay? So that's the difference between glucose and glycogen. Glucose is what we consume, and then it gets turned into glycogen to store it. Glucose is the main source of fuel for our cells when it's been converted. All right, so we store glycogen, and then we take that glycogen back out, and we reconvert it to glucose, and we use that as energy. When the body doesn't need to use glucose for energy, it stores it in the liver and muscles, right? That is where it's going to store glucose as glycogen. This stored form of glucose is made up of many connected glucose molecules, and we call it glycogen, right? Glucose you consume gets turned to glycogen and gets stored, and then we're going to get that glycogen back out of storage, reconstitute it, and we're going to use it as energy, as glucose. We've got fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, but slow twitch muscle fibers are exactly that. They're going to contract slowly. They use oxygen. We call that aerobic pathways. So they use these aerobic pathways that use oxygen to create energy. It takes a long time to fatigue these muscles. So this is the horse that can just keep going at a slow pace, but continually. Right? The turtle has a lot of slow twitch muscle fibers. Doesn't produce very much lactic acid. It's your endurance type sports. Okay? Your fast twitch muscle fibers, and there are type A and type B, but your fast twitch muscle fibers, they contract really, really quickly. It doesn't use oxygen to create that type of energy. These, however, fatigue very quickly. And in doing this, it creates a lot of lactic acid. This is for our strength and speed exercises. If you look at those two graphics, we've got the marathon runner, tall, skinny, lanky, versus the sprinter. You think about horses the same way. Think about your Arabian endurance horse, lean, versus your quarter horse sprinter or your thoroughbred sprinter. If you actually look at the muscle fibers underneath the microscope, the fast twitch muscle fibers actually look more light pink or white because they don't have a lot of blood supply. Because what does blood supply do? Blood supply brings oxygen, and we don't need oxygen for these because they work in an anaerobic or oxygen-free environment. It's also why these fast twitch muscle fibers have a very short window that they work before they have to be recharged. So one of the goals is, how do we recharge them fast? Because that might be the difference between winning and losing. Finally, the final part of the glossary that I want to mention is GLUT4. Now, it sounds kind of scary, and it's 8 o'clock at night, and it's, we're going into a long weekend. Why is she getting all sciencey with us? But GLUT4 is actually quite simple. It's a glucose transporter. So it's really important that we can eat all the glucose, eat all the food, and convert all the glucose that we want. But if we can't transport it, if we can't get it out of the blood and off into the target organs, then it's pointless. There are lots of different glucose transporters. Literally, they transport glucose out of the blood and into the cell membrane or wherever it's going to be used. that is what GLUT4 does. Now, the difference between GLUT4 and some of the other glucose transporters, GLUT4 is controlled or triggered, turned on by insulin. So you can see here, we've got our little insulin receptor, this blue cylinder. The little red dots are insulin, and they're going to float along. What they're going to do is they're going to notice there's a lot of glucose floating around in the blood, right? And then that's going to tell the pancreas, secrete insulin, because you've got to get rid of that glucose. So the pancreas secretes insulin. We have it floating around. It attaches to one of those little insulin receptors, and then that is like a key in a lock that turns and says, okay, GLUT4, get up onto that cell membrane because we're going to have to use you now. So you can see that it goes from floating around inside the cell, and it gets up onto the cell wall, and it spreads itself out, and now it's active, and that glucose will now enter the cell. Okay? We'll come back to it throughout the presentation, but insulin signals for the GLUT4 transporter to get in place so that glucose can come in. There are instances where that insulin receptor is broken, which we're not going to discuss today. We'll discuss that on another webinar, but that's insulin resistance in those metabolic type horses. If that little blue receptor is broken, then the insulin can't turn the key, and it can't tell the GLUT4 transporter to get up there and allow glucose into the cell. So cells take up carbohydrates, or that glucose, from blood plasma in the form of glucose, which is stored as glycogen in the liver and skeletal muscle, as we've mentioned. For optimal performance, horses must effectively utilize glucose and maintain their glycogen stores. That can be difficult. Carbohydrate availability is vital to their ability to use it and store it. If we could find a way for the muscle cells to further increase their uptake of glucose, it may be possible to improve performance and even delay fatigue, right? Because we're going to get more glucose into the cell. It's going to be used immediately, or it's going to be stored as glycogen, and we're going to keep funneling it in there so that it's always on the shelf ready for us to use, right? It's constantly there ready for us to use when we need it. We're not fatiguing. When we fatigue, it's because there's no glycogen there for me to use. I'm trying to find it, there's none there, and I just run out of gas and the car stops. That is what happens with fatigue. Horses, unfortunately, have very slow glycogen replacement. So we need to find ways to improve that. The gastrointestinal tract of a horse is really not well suited to digesting starches and other carbohydrates. So their ability to utilize glucose can be limited. Because remember, horses in the wild don't really do anything. They have very infrequent short bursts of energy, and if that short burst of energy wasn't fast enough to get away from the predator, then survival of the fittest, that one's gone. The mechanisms involved in glycogen synthesis are not as productive in horses as they are in other species. We talked about GLUT4 being the primary transporter, and it's responsible for moving that glucose into the cell. So how can we add something to the race formula to improve all this? To get more glucose into the cell, reduce fatigue, and store more glycogen. So it's on the shelf ready to use whenever I need it, which will decrease fatigue. How can I do that? We do it with an ingredient, a trace mineral called chromium. It's needed in very small amounts, but it's absolutely critical. We're using an organic form. Obviously, the organic forms are much more bioavailable than the inorganic forms, as it is with any of our minerals. Research on chromium in horses started back in the mid-90s, and it's been ongoing since then. Back in 97, Jackson and Associates looked at chromium requirements for exercising horses and suggested that they may be higher. in the exercising horse than the sedentary horse. Why? Because the exercising horse is utilizing more glucose, and so chromium plays a huge role in driving that insulin unlocking. We can increase insulin's ability to unlock that GLUT4 transporter using chromium. So the particular chromium that we're using, it's water soluble, it's highly bioavailable, as I mentioned, in organic form. It improves glucose utilization, which boosts the immune function and athletic performance. Now, as I mentioned, there is a role for chromium also in metabolic syndrome, but we'll talk about that on another webinar. First product of its kind on the market. 20 years of research have gone into ChemTrace Chromium. Over 50 peer-reviewed and research studies, which is absolutely critical. You know that everything we do at DAC is fact and science-based. This particular product is registered in over 35 countries, manufactured right here in America, and sourced from US-based raw ingredients. That's really, really important, as we've seen in our current world climate. It's important that our chain of getting ingredients does not ever get a hitch in it, and we can constantly always get our ingredients so that we can keep supplying those to our customers. In March of 2020, ChemTrace Chromium was approved by the FDA for use in horses. Now, people had been selling chromium prior to that, chromium yeast, chromium, different types of chromium, but it was actually illegal. This is chromium propionate, and as of March, approved for use in horses. Oh, shoot. So what I want to do is I want to show you a little video here on the role of insulin in the body, and bear with me with the audio here.
When food is ingested, it travels along the digestive tract, where it is broken down into its component nutrients in order to be absorbed into the bloodstream. One such nutrient is glucose, a simple sugar. Glucose gets absorbed by the stomach and intestines and then enters the bloodstream. It travels through the circulation to all body cells. Once absorbed into the bloodstream, glucose circulates, causing the blood sugar level to rise. An increased level of blood sugar sends a signal to the pancreatic beta cells, which respond by secreting the hormone insulin into the circulation. Insulin is necessary for glucose to reach and be used by several important target tissues throughout the body. These include the liver, muscle, and adipose tissue. Insulin is necessary to keep blood glucose levels stable in the body. Glucose enters the cell through a process called facilitated diffusion.
Okay, so that's how insulin works. I want to do another little video on how chromium works and how it can intercept some of that in the horse, that poor utilization, that poor insulin receptor, upregulate more of those insulin receptors so we can get more glucose into the cell. So we'll go ahead and play this video.
Animal nutritionists formulate diets to provide carbohydrates as an energy source for livestock. Using different digestive processes, cows and pigs convert these carbohydrates into glucose which is ultimately released into the bloodstream. Once in the bloodstream, glucose can reach different organs in the body. When the blood reaches the animal's pancreas, beta cells inside the pancreas detect the rising glucose levels. To reduce the glucose level, beta cells release insulin into the bloodstream. As blood circulates through the animal, insulin and glucose exit the bloodstream into tissues to reach the animal's cells. Many of the animal's cells have specific receptors on their surfaces that bind to the circulating insulin. Insulin acts like a key in a lock to open the cell by activating glucose transporters so that the circulating glucose can get inside the cell. The dietary trace element, chromium, is necessary to optimize the activation of the insulin receptor so that more glucose can get into the cell. A maximum of 4 chromium molecules may bind to one insulin receptor, which can lead to an 8-fold difference in insulin receptor activation. Adding supplemental chemtrace chromium propionate to the diet provides the additional chromium for insulin receptor activation. Chromium enhances this reaction, causing glucose transporter activation, allowing additional glucose to enter the cell. The additional glucose will allow for more energy to be available for proper cell function. Proper functioning cells can lead to a healthier, more productive animal.
Okay, so there's a little overview of glucose and insulin and how chromium can get those insulin receptors to work better. So insulin stimulates glucose uptake, right? Readily available chromium from the chemtrace chromium optimizes the activation of those insulin receptors. It makes sure they get turned on. The cell uptakes glucose, and the additional glucose is available for energy. So what do we know about horses in particular and different types of energy they're doing and what type of energy they're using? When we're doing those lower intensity exercise, walk, trot, dressage, maybe low level jumping, about 42% of the energy is supplied through fat. So we should have high fat diets with these horses that are doing long, slow exercise and need to be really calm and not do really fast, powerful exercise. About 58% comes from carbohydrates. But as you ramp up the intensity and you want more fast twitch muscle fiber activation, the energy substrate fat is used at only about 30%, and the energy from carbohydrates is used at about 70%. You can see in the graph that when we start to increase our exercise intensity, we need to utilize more glucose. So we have more glucose coming in and we're using more glucose. What is glucose? Glucose carbohydrates. We've talked about that. What could your horse do with additional glucose? Do you think your horse might go faster? Do you think he might recover better? There has been research to show that supplemental chromium has been shown to increase the movement of GLUT4 receptors. Remember I said insulin attaches to the insulin receptor. The insulin receptor is the key in the lock that tells GLUT4, get up on the wall so you can allow the glucose in. Adding chromium to the diet has been shown to increase the movement of those GLUT4 transporters up onto the wall of the cell to allow glucose in. Interesting, could be very valuable. So, in summary, adding the chromium to the racing formula will help activate insulin receptors, more glucose will enter the cell, more energy will be available, and that will improve health and performance. The other area that it can help these horses at high intense exercise is we know that intense exercise causes stress on horses. We also know that everything these horses doing intense exercise go through, the trailering, the stabling, you know, all of that, probably the low forage diets, all increase stress. Stress releases cortisol. That's a hormone that is a signal of stress. The release of that cortisol or corticosteroid alters how nutrients are utilized in the body. So you get stressed, you shoot out all this cortisol, and cortisol signals to the body, stop utilizing that glucose for growth or for immune function. We need it to get rid of this stress. Okay? And we want to stop that. We don't want those nutrients to be petitioned away from performance. We have other ways of decreasing stress. We don't want the cortisol to shunt glucose primarily away and off into the body to deal with stress. We need it to stay in the muscle, ready to be used for performance. But look at all these different stressors on the horse, whether it be the environment, the training, the medications, traveling, health, metabolic diet, the list is endless. So chromium in high-level performance horses is going to increase the uptake of glucose, which should help them with energy, which can go one of two ways. It can help with mitigating stress, and it can also make them go faster. So do you have any questions? Hopefully that wasn't too sciencey for our Thursday evening. I wanted to keep it short because I wanted to make sure you had time for plenty of questions.